You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 192, The Fall of France, Breakouts. This week, a big thank you goes out to Neil and Sean for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. Members can get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes and member-only episodes released once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. After the Germans had crossed the Meuse and had beaten back the early French counterattacks on May 14th, and then had secured their position by bringing more and more troops across the river, there were two different stories about what was supposed to happen next. Among a certain group of German commanders, the plan was always to push forward as quickly as possible, with men like Guderian and Rommel immediately looking for how they could start towards their ultimate objective of reaching the coast to cut off the French and British forces in Belgium. But above and below this group of division and corps leaders, there were many who believed that things were going to calm down for at least a few days after the crossing. Among officers closer to the front, there was some confusion, which could be expected at any time during a war. Not every officer all the way down to the front lines knows what's going to happen next. They're kind of just going along with orders and going along with the general plan. However, along the chain of command, reaching from the front all the way up to Hitler, there were many leaders who believed that it was essential that the advances of the armored forces be stopped so that infantry forces could catch up and secure their flanks. Between the 14th and the 16th of May 1940, it would be the hard-charging generals that would get to dictate the path forward for the advance. And this episode will discuss the continuing attacks of all the bridgeheads that had been built by the panzer divisions and the ways that they exploited those bridgeheads to continue forward. After the crossing of the Meuse, the next major obstacle for the Germans was the Ardennes Canal, which runs roughly north and south to the west of the Meuse at Sedan. French forces hoped that, even if the counterattacks failed, they would still be able to reform a defensive line along the canal. But already on the morning of May 14th, the Germans were destroying this hope. This was because small groups of the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions were already fanning out and charging hard for various bridges over the canal. Several of them would then fall into the hands of German troops throughout the day of May 14th, with the biggest problem being the fact that the captured bridges were quite widely dispersed, and this made it difficult for the French to kind of react to their capture. The problem was the capture of these bridges would set up both panzer divisions for their next advance, but the French were at least trying to prepare to meet that advance. Back on the night of the 13th, just hours after the Germans had crossed the river, General Georges had taken the steps to prepare this line of defenses, just in case the counterattacks that he also ordered at that time were to fail. This meant that at roughly the same time, there were 3 different groups of French reinforcements moving into position to make their attacks or to prepare for their defense. There were the army reserves that had been given to La Fontaine for the initial counterattack on the 14th, then the 3 divisions given to Flavigny for the aborted counterattack later on the 14th, and then behind both of those moved the 6th Army into position. This army, commanded by General Touchon, had originally been positioned in southern France along the border with Italy, but it was decided to try and move it as quickly as possible into an area behind and between the 2nd and 9th armies that had been hit so hard by the German armored units in the days prior. The movement of an entire army would take time though, but such movements had been done many times, as, all the way back to the First World War, and they had great effect. And the goal was to move them north as quickly as possible to get in front of the German troops. To give Touchon added strength, the 6th Army was also given the 2nd Armored Division and the 14th Infantry Division, which were both considered to be top quality. These actions are important, not just because they would shape the fighting in the days that followed, but also because it tells us something about how French actions during this period should be evaluated. In this moment of crisis, the things that the French were doing were not wrong. arranging multiple counterattacks, some that could move immediately, others that would take more time, and then planning for the possibility of failure by bringing in even more forces was a good idea. And then committing forces like the 2nd Armored from the operational reserve that George had built up was again a good idea. It was not the concepts or the ideas that were bad for the French here, but instead simply the fact that they could not react fast enough to what was happening. The 6th Army would not arrive in time to stand in front of the German panzer divisions to save the 2nd and 9th French armies from disaster. Instead, it would only be able to slowly move north, and by the time that it arrived, all it could do was prevent the Germans from approaching the N River and crossing south of that river, sort of just occupying the left flank of the German advance. But by that point, the crossing of the river and attacking these French troops was actually pretty far down the list of German priorities because they were instead hard charging towards the coast. The 6th Army would simply arrive too late to make a difference. And the reason that it would be too late were the movements of all of the German armored divisions on the 14th, 15th, and 16th. The 1st and 2nd Panzer divisions were beginning to push beyond the Ardennes Canal quite quickly, and they continued to move west and slightly south towards the village of Rethel. But between them and Rethel was terrain that was not exactly conducive to quick armored movements, and there were still French units that were fighting hard to prevent the Germans from accomplishing their goals. This fighting included instances like at the village of La Horne, where the 1st Rifle Regiment, which had been so important to the crossing of the Meuse on the 13th, would experience its most costly day of the entire campaign. This was mostly possible due to the commitment of more units of French reserves, and most importantly, they brought with them heavier equipment. The units of the 3rd Spahi Brigade were able to bring up 2 anti-tank guns, 4 mortars, and 11 machine guns, and get them in place in the village before the Germans arrived. This gave them the firepower to hold back the first German infantry attacks, and it was only after the 1st Panzer Division had brought up more artillery and tanks that they were able to push through La Horne. But bringing up that equipment took time. It delayed the Germans. The French forces obviously were not giving up, even if they were constantly in positions that had to be abandoned to the Germans. In general, it was a day of really hard fighting for the exhausted 1st and 2nd Panzer divisions, even though the 2nd Panzer had it slightly easier because it was on the north side and there was slightly different terrain, but really it didn't make a huge difference. These advances were important because it was believed among the German leaders that if they could just push through the French forces in front of them, then they would be able to break through into more open country. Orders back at Kleist's headquarters were starting to get confusing, though. Late on the 15th, the orders given to Kleist were that after his panzer forces had crossed the river and expanded their bridgeheads, they were under all circumstances to halt. This would set the stage for the first major disagreement among German commanders, although it would not really come to a head until the 17th. This is because even though Kleist had been told to halt, on the 16th he gave his order of the day, which was to continue all of the advances of the previous day. But then late on the 16th, there was a major change, with a new order sent down to Guderian's forces, along with other of the forwardmost units sort of in the area, that they were to halt immediately. Guderian's reaction to this order and the fallout from this order specifically on May 17th will be a major topic for next episode. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you have self-care non-negotiables? I take a walk every day. Rain, shine, snow, it's happening. Maybe therapy needs to be one of those things. Maybe one of your days needs to be a therapy day. But it's sometimes hard to add yet another thing to the calendar, and that's where BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp is entirely online, so you can do it from the coziness of your own home, or from anywhere else, for that matter. To get started, all you have to do is fill out a questionnaire, which will help match you with a licensed therapist. You can then switch therapists at any time. It's flexible, it's convenient, and it's just a few clicks away. So never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/WWII today to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com wwii. While there were major French counterattack efforts that were launched against Guderian's forces near Sedan, the same was not really the case for the panzer divisions that had crossed further north. The 6th Panzer Division, part of the corps commanded by General Reinhardt, had crossed the Meuse at Monthermé, and then after some hard fighting had managed to break out of the areas right around the river. Once that happened, they were off to the races, and the troops of the 6th Panzer had advanced 55 kilometers during the afternoon of May 15th to reach the town of Montcornet. This represented a major failing on the part of the French Ninth Army, which should have had troops in position to react and sort of counteract such a German attack, but they did not. It was such a failing that on the night of May 14th, even before that major advance had been made the next day, the command of the Ninth Army was switched from General Korapp to General Gerard, who had previously commanded the 7th Army. This is why, if you look at a map of the invasion of France, you may see the 9th Army labeled as having either commander, Gerard or Korapp. Korapp was in command when the German attack started and when they crossed the Meuse, but the switch was made quite early in the campaign, and this is why some maps will display it either way. But just changing the commander, no matter who the old or new commanders were, could not change the fact that there were a mountain of problems for the 9th Army, because even though the situation with the 6th Panzer was very concerning, the developments further north were even worse, because it was in that area that the 7th Panzer was beginning to run wild. To the north of the advances made by Reinhardt, the elements of the 7th Panzer Division were providing perfect textbook examples of why the German attacks had been so successful up to May 15th, and why they would be even more successful in the days that followed. In the morning of May 15th, the 25th Panzer Regiment would encounter 2 French tank battalions, with somewhere around 170 tanks, a mixture of the monster Char B1s and the Hotchkiss H-39s. These French tanks were making preparations to launch a counterattack later in the day, and were fueling in preparation for their later adventures. They greatly outnumbered the German tanks that were about to attack them, and only about 30 of the German tanks were Panzer IIIs and IVs. The rest, about 90 of them, were Panzer I and IIs, which were useless in a direct confrontation with the French tanks. But the Germans were still able to get the upper hand when they attacked the French at around 10 a.m., with the 25th Panzer Regiment hitting the surprised French quite hard. The 25th was then pulled back from the fight because Rommel, the commander of the 7th Panzer, wanted to continue to push forward, leaving the fight to the 5th Panzer Division's 31st Panzer Regiment instead. They would then fight it out with the French for most of the day, benefiting heavily from Stuka attacks and the decisive movement of the available armored units. The arrival of the 5th Panzer allowed the 7th to continue its hard charge to the west, which it would continue throughout the 15th, with its tanks leading the way, instead of a more cautious approach that may have involved more infantry. During the late afternoon, it would meet its objective for the 15th. This is a great example of why the Germans were so successful. Instead of getting bogged down in a fight against a larger enemy, they instead still greatly prioritized continuing the advance. The result of this mindset of constant motion and initiative would be used time and time again in the days that followed, and it would allow the German panzer divisions to get the French off balance and then eventually to completely outrun their ability to respond. Late in the day on May 16th, after another day of advancing, Rommel's 7th Panzer finally crossed the French border. They had a lot further to travel than Guderian, who had crossed the border far earlier. Although for Rommel and the 7th, this was really just a line on the map because they continued to push forward into the evening. This move was fully supported by Rommel's commander, General Hoth, and his commander, General von Klug, as they hoped to continue west as the expected French counterattack forces from the north had not really materialized. Continuing forward was against the previously agreed upon plan, as they had envisioned the 7th stopping after it moved into France to allow for consolidation along the front. These new orders that were written up for Rommel allowed him to push forward to Avesnes-sur-Helpe, but in this movement he was restricted both in terms of how far he could advance and how quickly he could advance, the goal being to keep the German armored units at least somewhat closer to supporting units, just in case that French counterattack from the north actually happened. However, these restrictions were never received by Rommel because by the time that they arrived at his headquarters, he was already moving forward with some of his panzer units. Now, this may surprise you to learn, actually it won't because this is all we've been talking about for the past 3 episodes, but the French were caught off guard by the bold German attack down the road to Avesnes, and some French artillery was actually captured while the motorized troops that had been defending this area of the front were pushed back in disarray. Apparently, the motorized infantry unit was not even remotely prepared for a German attack and did not even know that the Germans were in the area before they were already under fire, which I guess is always a recipe for disaster. It was not a really easy fight though, and there was real fighting along this road to Avesnes, but by the end of the day, Rommel and the leading elements of the 7th Panzer were in Avesnes. A German soldier that would advance down the same road in the days that followed would write that, quote, "I have never seen anything like the scenes along Rommel's route of advance. His tanks had run into a French division coming down the same road, and they had just kept advancing right on past it. For the next 5 or 6 miles, there were hundreds of trucks and tanks, some driven into the ditches, others burned out, many still carrying dead or injured." End quote. In total, the quick advance was an attack of around 15 kilometers, and while there would still be fighting throughout the night in Avesnes, by dawn the last French forces had been pushed out of the town and were retreating further to the west. Now the question became, what to do next? The orders that had been provided by Hoth and von Klug were for Rommel to not push forward indefinitely, and even the advances to Avesnes was kind of pushing the limits of what their orders had been. But Rommel was already looking forward, further ahead, to the next objective, and he was looking at the target of the French village of Landrecies, where there was a crossing over the Sambre River, making it very valuable real estate for the Germans to control. It would help them cross yet another river. Landrecies would be an advance of about 18 kilometers, and if he was going to do that, well, he might as well just push forward to the larger town of Lacateau. That was only another 12 kilometers. That seemed reasonable, just another short little hop. The advance to Landrecies was another familiar tale of surprised French forces that were totally unprepared to fight German units during the early morning of May 17th. The bridge and Landrecies were taken without much of a problem, even though by this point Rommel was at the front with only 2 tank battalions and 3 motorcycle platoons, with most of his forces sort of strung out over the last 24 hours of advances. Over that time, he had advanced 60 kilometers, which is a truly staggering amount, especially by pre-war calculations. But Lacateau seemed ripe for the taking, and so Rommel continued to push forward, and it would be captured at about 6:30 in the morning. It was finally at this point that Rommel, with a shrinking number of units under his direct command and with more and more kilometers piling up behind him, that he took a moment, handed over command of his advanced units to another officer, and began to make his way back to Avesnes to re-establish contact with his headquarters and to ensure that the rest of his division were moving up quickly. In a perfect example of just how chaotic this situation was, when Rommel was moving back to Avesnes, he would encounter French troops retreating on the roads between Lacateau and Avesnes, troops that he had to drive through at a very rapid pace. This would eventually result in Rommel's tiny detachment of only a few vehicles capturing 40 French trucks on his way back to the rest of his division. When he met up with the rest of his division and made his way to headquarters, he found that there were some higher officers that were a little displeased with him. Rommel had very conveniently assured that he could not be reached for multiple lengthy periods of time over the past few days. This allowed him to do what he wanted, which was to continue forward, even though throughout the day, multiple orders arrived at his headquarters that he needed to slow down and that he needed to stop immediately. But in the end, it didn't really matter what orders Rommel had ignored, because he was successful, and it was simply impossible for such actions to be punished. And so instead, as is the case with many officers that ignore orders but are successful, instead of facing disciplinary actions, Rommel instead received the Knight's Cross due to his personal bravery during the advance. Now, while the exact situation on the ground was not known in London and Paris, and in fact it was changing far quicker than they could keep up with it, it was clear by May 17th that things were not going according to plan. The Meuse had been crossed and multiple German armored divisions were on their way west. These developments would result in multiple meetings at the highest level between the two allies, meetings that would only grow in importance in the days that followed. One important change, I guess, that I should mention that would take place was the fact that these meetings were attended by the new British Prime Minister, who had taken over for Chamberlain on May 10th, and he had been in office for about a week at this point, when some of the most important meetings of the campaign would occur on May 16th and 17th. I'm of course talking about one Winston Churchill, and I realize I've kind of sailed over this Prime Minister Churchill thing, but I've made the decision that I'm going to circle back to the Chamberlain replacement during the Battle of Britain episodes that will be the next series on the podcast. I'm really just trying to keep these episodes more focused on events in France, instead of going off on a long London diversion, which would last several episodes. But anyway, back to France on May 16th. Before the important meeting on May 16th, on the night before, an important event had occurred. The first RAF Bomber Command raid of the Ruhr region had happened. Since the beginning of the war, both the British and French bomber forces had been very careful to limit their raids in ways that would do everything possible to prevent civilian casualties. They'd spent some time bombing strictly military targets like German fleet bases or doing propaganda missions where leaflets were dropped over Germany. But the German invasion of the West caused everything to change. The British War Cabinet decided on May 15th that any restrictions on bombing had to be removed, with the only remaining provision being that bombing had to be aimed at military objectives. And this change would result in the first bombing raid of the Ruhr on the night of May 15th to 16th, the first step in a campaign that would last until the very closing days of the war. On the very next day, there would be a meeting of the Supreme War Council with French and British military and political leaders. Churchill's account of this meeting is perhaps the most famous, mostly due to some of his questions that he would ask the French leaders. Gamelin would provide a military overview based on the events of the previous days. Churchill would later tell the British War Cabinet that he found Daladier and Gamelin to be depressed, but Prime Minister Reynaud to be in better spirit. At the point where this meeting was occurring, the Germans had not truly broken through in the ways that they would in the days that followed, but even at this stage there was concern about what the French might have access to or what they might be able to do to stop them. And it would be around the question of reserves that Churchill would, rather famously, ask Gamelin where his strategic reserve was, to which he would reply that he had none. This answer provides in many ways the centerpiece of many arguments about the failure of the French armies during the invasion. That, they were in a position where they had no reserves, and so when Churchill asked that, Gamelin just said there were none. And it certainly was a problem that was the answer that he was kind of forced to give. But I think sometimes the response is not taken within the proper context. The French army did have reserves, and the last two episodes have essentially been built around the story of how those reserves were deployed. Divisional and corps reserves that La Fontaine attacked with on the afternoon of May 14th, Army and Army Group reserves that Flavigny had under his command at Sedan and that General Bruno had at Dinant. And then finally, there was the even larger movement of the French Sixth Army from the south. The problem was not that the French did not have reserves, it's that the local reserves had all been committed and failed, while the movement of larger reserves from southern France were simply taking too long. But the nuances of the situation and the sort of previous efforts of the French army were little comfort to the leaders in the meeting on May 16th, a meeting that would later cause Churchill to write, quote, "I was dumbfounded. What were we to think of the great French army and its highest chiefs? It had never occurred to me that any commanders would have left themselves unprovided with a massive maneuver. I admit this was one of the greatest surprises I have had in my life." End quote. And that's basically the story that has stuck for over 80 years, that the French had no reserves and could do nothing against the Germans, when in fact they had simply already committed or were in the process of committing all of the reserves. They were there, they were just using them. While researching this part of the episode and a lot of what I just said, I ended up pulling up the conclusions document for the British War Cabinet, which is essentially a summary of the meetings that occurred. And this particular conclusions document was for a particular meeting that occurred on May 17th at 10 a.m. So the day after this War Council meeting that we were just talking about. During this meeting, Churchill would inform the others in the government about the meetings with the French and give a general overview of the information that he had received. However, another sentence really struck me, and it's a perfect example of how evaluations and understanding of events can be fundamentally different than later sort of evaluations and understandings. Next episode, we'll be discussing the German armored division's push for the coast. But when the May 16th and 17th meetings occurred in Paris and London, the idea of having the forces in Belgium cut off was not seen as a high possibility. We know today that this is exactly what would happen, and the forces would be cut off, and then Dunkirk would occur. It'd be a whole thing. But at 10 a.m. on May 17th, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir John Dill, would have his words summarized as him having said, quote, "Some comfort may be taken, however, from the fact that the flower of the French army was in the north, and not in the part of the line where the blow had fallen," end quote. I find this sentence so funny because of the criticism that is leveled against the French for placing their best troops in Belgium. And here at the time, the British leaders were of the opinion that that decision was actually a good thing. Oh, their best forces were in the north, so, they weren't in the path of this German advance. Whereas today, many historians and even many contemporary people in the years that followed the French defeat would say that, wow, it would have been great if those really good French forces were right in the way of the German advance that was about to happen. Anyway, I just found that sentence interesting, so you got a 2-minute diversion about it. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you will join me next episode when we will find out why placing all the best French forces and the BEF in Belgium was very much not a good thing, because Guderian was about to race to the sea, and there was only one thing that could stop him: German High Command.